A warm welcome to our webinar, one of many talks part of the World Academic Forum Stockholm Summit. This is Stockholm's united academia coming together to manifest academia's role in society and to explore solutions for the global challenges of our time. World Academic Forum is hosted by the City of Stockholm and its 18 independent universities. My name is Klara Edlund, and I'm very proud to be representing Sophiahemmet University today as the explorer for this webinar. I will present my co-explorers in just a minute. I'm humbled and happy to share with you that we have participants registered here today from 50 different countries from all over the world. That is just amazing, and it tells me that mental health and lifestyle among young really is a main priority on our global agenda for sustainable health, especially with regards to world crisis. The topic of today's conversation will focus on just that, young adults' mental health and lifestyle, with special focus on the pandemic. With me today, around this imaginary digital dinner table, I have three eminent professors. I am honored and a bit starstruck, I must say, to introduce to you my company today. Professor Jorunn Sundgot-Borgen from Norwegian School of Sports Science in Oslo. Professor Berman, Uppsala University, and the President of International Society of Behavioral Medicine. And Professor Pierre Côté, Ontario Tech, Canada. And again, I'm Klara Edlund, an associate professor at Sophiahemmet University here in Stockholm. Before we start our conversation, I would like to share a couple of thoughts with you. About a year ago, when we first started talking about today's event, the World Academic Forum, the pandemic was the major global crisis, having a profound effect on people's lives on all levels. Since then, another major world event has taken place, and Europe is at war. We're about to talk about mental health and lifestyle here today, and I want to start up our conversation by highlighting that major world events affect our mental health. And at most, we see an increase in the most serious consequence of mental illness, suicide. There is a well-established link between income and suicide, as well as between mental illness and suicide. To start our conversation, I would like to illustrate how another world event affected income and suicide with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1990. This chart will show income and suicides in a number of countries in the world. Each bubble is a country. Each bubble is marked with its country's flag, and the size of the bubble is reflecting the size of the population. At the bottom, on the horizontal axis, you see income, GDP per capita. To the left, on the vertical axis, you see number of suicide per 100,000 people. What this graph will illustrate is the impact of one major world event in 1990, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Pay close attention to what happens to Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Latvia, Estonia, and Czech Republic as far as income and suicide at 1990, and how the countries thereafter recover over time. This will be really quick, so please pay close attention. I know, that went by with the blink of an eye. We'll take another look before we move on. What this illustrates is that major world events affect global health. And with the pandemic, the war, and with concerns about future crises, we have every reason to start summing up what we've learned so far and to really start talking about how to prepare for the future. Let's take a quick look again at this data. In our study, where Pierre and I and our team are working on mental health problems and pain in university students over time, we've been studying them before the pandemic, before the outbreak of the pandemic, and during the pandemic. Our results indicate that students in Stockholm didn't report an increase of symptoms of mental health. At the same time, Anne and her research group studied students at other universities in Sweden with regards to mental health problems. Their studies showed that students reported considerable negative consequences related to mental health and academic self-efficacy. I know that a number of us would love to get into a methodological discussion about these divergent results. But for today, we're just going to emphasize that we have a long way to go as far as understanding the impact on health of the pandemic. One area where the results seem to be more conclusive as far as health during the pandemic is eating disorders. Both Jorunn and I have worked most of our work lives with eating disorders, and these results are troubling to us. Studies suggest that an increase of eating disorders among students during the pandemic, and also an increase in internalization of thin and low body fat ideals. This in turn increased the risk of developing an eating disorder. With this, I would like to start the conversation around the table with our guests. Our conversation today is about mental health and lifestyle among young adults. Topics that still can be stigmatized and difficult to talk about. If we want to open up to the subject and really start talking about it, our own stories may be a good starting point. To a lot of people, mental health issues are private and the thought of getting help is far off. To start the conversation, I'm wondering if you, Anne, would like to share some thoughts about this.
Yes, thank you so much, Klara. And it's really an honor to be at this table and discussing these really important issues. Yes, I told you before, and I want to tell our participants now that when I was 17, I had started university, and I was depressed at the time. About a third of university students are depressed or have anxiety, even more in some studies. And at the time, that's how I felt. I had a friend who also had suicidal thoughts, and she was going to a psychologist. Now, at the time, I didn't have any suicidal thoughts, but I was feeling depressed. So I went to meet this psychologist, and she was really nice. She smiled, I felt comfortable with her, but I could not see how she could help me in my situation in any way. How could she change anything in my life just by talking? Later in my life, when I became a psychologist and I had a reason in my life to seek help, I did go to psychological help, and I've had huge benefits from learning to talk about feelings and circumstances and how everything fits together. We know that many people can feel like me, how could this help? But also there's a lot of barriers to seeking help. Stigma, a fear of being regarded as crazy if you seek help. So much of my work has been about making all sorts of psychological interventions, we'll talk more about that later, available through digital means.
So a lot of stigma going on with expressing thoughts on psychological issues. And another aspect of lifestyle that may be difficult to talk about is food insecurity. And that is really one of our basic needs to stay healthy. And I remember, Pierre, when you and I first met, that was 3 years ago in Paris. And we had our very first talk about mental health in students and in young adults. And you shared with me that you were concerned because your data showed that students in Canada were reporting food insecurity. And I'm thinking maybe first you'd like to share with us what food insecurity is and what are our thoughts on food insecurity, and can we even link it to eating disorders, Jorunn? So
yeah, thank you very.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, definitely. Food insecurity is associated with the development of disordered eating. And talking about stigma, there has been for years so difficult for people and students suffering from eating disorders and, as Anna said, other mental problems or issues. But during the last, I would say 5 years, it seems like it's easier to tell a clinician or your teacher or friends about your mental health issues. And from my experience, and most of my research are from student athletes and also athletes, and the fact that a number of well-known athletes have told their story in the media in terms of depression and eating disorders and so on, I really think that that helps the other students, and it's easier to talk about, although it's still a stigma, because when they experience and realize that these very tough athletes that are expected to be so strong and high self-confidence and so on, that also they develop mental health problems, it's easier. But we do have a problem related to trainers and those who are on the top of the sports federation and so on. It's not accepted to talk about mental health issues, but the younger people want to talk about it.
Mm-hmm. So at one end of the spectrum, if we're staying with the topic of food and eating behaviors, we have the disordered eating with the restriction of food intake. And on the other end, I'm looking at you, Pierre, now, with the food insecurity, I would really like to talk more about that because that was really new to me, where we have, let me put it like an involuntary food restriction. And what that even means. So Pierre, would you like to share what that even means? When I was talking to my colleagues here in Sweden, they were like, Klara, food insecurity, what is that even?
Thank you, Klara. And like Anne, I remember vividly when I moved from my hometown in Quebec, a small town, to go to the larger cities to attend university. It was really a shock to the system. And one of the first things that I had to do, really, back in the 80s was learn to cook and learn to go to the grocery store and get food and learn to feed myself properly. And I had not been trained for that, obviously. In my culture in Quebec back then, that's not how it was. So I really became aware of the needs at the time to eat well. But what we've discovered in our research in Canada is that this is a significant problem for, at least at my universities in 2 of our faculties, for more than a quarter of the students. They suffer from food insecurity. Now, what is food insecurity? Food insecurity is basically the inability to afford and consume good quantity, enough food, and good quality food. So basically, you suffer from some level of nutritional deficiency. And we live in high-income countries, Norway, Sweden, Canada. And I was perplexed by this and shocked. How is it that in our societies, young adults do not have enough food to eat? And we're starting to unpack this, and it's often related to the fact that, pardon me, in my country, students in universities don't only go to school, they also have to work. They also have to do what's necessary to find the means to survive. And they have to make very, very difficult decision. Do I buy books, or do I buy fresh food, vegetables, meat, and whatever is necessary for me to survive adequately? So this concept of food insecurity, I don't think is a concept that is related only to low and middle income countries. At least in my society in Canada, it's a big concern on our university campuses. And that opens a door to think about interventions. And later we'll talk about how food insecurity is related to mental health.
Mm-hmm. I think it's very important to talk about food insecurity, and it's actually a new area within when we are talking about athletes and disordered eating behavior. Years back, we always thought about athletes who, by purpose, restrict their diet and then develop disordered eating and eating disorder. But during the last 3 years, there are a number of studies emphasizing food insecurity and the fact that athletes are not able to buy the right food, or they don't know which food they should buy. And that's also another explanation for a number of athletes developing low energy availability and disordered eating. So it's so important because most people, teachers and parents, and even the young people themselves, think about disordered eating and depression as a consequence of low energy availability, as they explain it by the fact that people are restricting their diet because they want to lose weight, but it's not always like that. I think we should have that in mind, those who are working with young people.
I think that's a really, really important thing to stress, that low energy availability, regardless of the reason for restricting your food, if it's because of food insecurity, the wish to lose weight, to what have you, increases the risk of mental health problems.
Yes. We have been so focused on the physiological consequences of restricting your diet, but nowadays we are actually focusing on the psychological consequences. We are so far behind when we are talking a diet and mental health. So we really have to focus on that area. And I think we'll learn quite a lot from this period with the pandemic also.
So food and energy availability obviously is one important aspect of staying healthy. And another important aspect of mental health and lifestyle is physical activity and exercise. And these are factors that are so central to many aspects of our well-being. And yet it's also closely linked to mental health and eating disorders in particular. I'm thinking, Jorunn, what are your thoughts on how the pandemic has affected us as far as physical activity in a public health perspective? I'm thinking that physical activity and exercise is both a protective factor to stay healthy and to even treat mental problems. And yet.
Yeah, I fully agree. And again, so far we have focused on the advantages of physical activity, and we've been talking about the physiological advantages, but I will stress the psychological advantage, and we do have evidence proving that it prevents the development of, for example, depression, and also it works well in terms of treatment of depression. So during the epidemic, I'm not only thinking, but I'm sorry to say that we have this data that a significant number of young people have stopped exercising. They've left the training centers and also the sports clubs because they were locked down. And specifically those, of course, the very young children and those teenagers, but also those up to 40 years. There's a significant drop in exercise.
Mhm.
And of course, on the long run, if they don't start exercising again, that will be a public health issue.
Mhm.
We know that exercise and smart eating will prevent many of the lifestyle diseases. So hopefully, and I will probably talk about that a little bit later, hopefully we do have some suggestions in terms of having them go back to exercise and sport again.
Mhm. Do you think that the dropout from sport and exercise is due to the lockdown and the restrictions due to the pandemic?
That's what they say, at least those who have dropped out. And of course, we know that it is a significant dropout from sport during the teen years, from like 13 to 17 years.
Yeah.
But it's much more than that in terms of numbers that have dropped out. So yes, it's due to the pandemic.
So
And it's during this period when they learn or take this as part of their lifestyle to being active.
Yeah.
So it's so important that we have them back to sport or regular exercise
Mhm.
again. So it's part of their lifestyle.
Yeah. So do we think of the actual sport environment, the context, as a central component to keep young in sports?
Yeah, definitely. And it should, of course, be easier for each kid or teenager or adult to choose where and how they want to exercise, or if they want to participate in competition or whatever. But of course, the culture where they are performing their exercise is extremely important. I know we do have toxic cultures in sports, for example, and also in fitness centers. That's probably another conference to talk about that.
Yes, that's a whole other talk.
Yes.
Also a really important topic. Something else that I've been thinking about along the line of lifestyle behavior and health is substance use and the use of illicit drugs. And I've been thinking about times of solitude during the pandemic and whether that has affected the use of substances. And I would love for you, Anne. You have a lot of experience with working with the substance use problems. If you would share with us some of your thoughts and data that's come out.
Yeah, thank you so much, Klara. Yes, I've been working a lot with digital interventions, from very minimal interventions, like just monitoring how much one uses, like filling in a form. That could be the monitoring. It could take 5 minutes, and giving a little feedback. That's a way of working with reducing problematic use. But I think one of the questions first we should look at now is, in relation to the pandemic, what did people use more alcohol or drugs or less? And I think that the jury is still out, as they say, on that question, that we can't really say definitively. We'll have to wait until we have more long-term data. But I've looked a little bit at the literature now, and I've seen that among adults, not students, then their drinks have increased in studies from the US per day, and also drinking over the minimum levels of harm, and also binge drinking, when you drink several drinks, more than 4 drinks a day for women and more than 5 drinks a day for men. So that's increased for adults. But studies among university students in the US, for students, it's a social activity to drink. It can be something that you do on your own, but that's more typical of older people. The huge rise in alcohol and drug use for students is because of is connected to the social context. And the social context disappeared during the pandemic. Are we going to have a drinking party on Zoom? How much fun is that? So studies have found that actually the number of drinks per week declined among university students, and also the number of drinks per day. But it could be that people drank more often, that the number of drinking days per week was a little bit higher. And looking at people who stayed at university versus the ones who went back home, if they went back home to live with their parents, the alcohol and drug consumption declined. And if they stayed at university, it didn't decline as much. But as you pointed out, we saw that in our study in Sweden, that students felt generally worse. About 75% of the ones we contacted from many universities in Sweden said that they felt worse during the pandemic mentally than they did before. Now, about half of these 75% also experienced positive aspects, because there has been a stress lowering effect of the pandemic. You didn't have to get up as early to get to class. You could just log on, you could eat your lunch while you were, there's a lot of flexibility that we've gotten. But the whole loss of the social context, the learning context, the environment, the stimulation of learning together with others, all of that has been gone. And so even though the mental health and the academic efficacy effects that we've seen have been worse, whether people turn to drinking and drugs to solve that seems to be less likely, because they're motivated to continue their studies and concerned also over what will happen. We did a study that it's just a thesis, a master's thesis, but of like free text responses that it just got finished the other day. And students have been so concerned, what about my future? What about job? How am I gonna, it's introduced not only food insecurity, it's exacerbated life insecurity for a lot of young people. And that's an existential question that maybe alcohol or drugs can dampen. That's the usual thing, but I'm not so sure that the jury is still out. We really don't know for the moment.
Any thoughts on that from you, Pierre or Jorunn?
Not specifically, but I think a closely related topic to this is the issue of sleep. Yeah. And how sleep in young adults and university students is actually related to poor mental health. And our data was clear about this. Again, university students, at least in my university, given their lifestyles and the demands that are put on them now, have very poor sleep quality. At least when we use standardized way to assess sleep, we don't put them all in a lab and put the electrodes on them and measure how they sleep. But if we use questionnaires, valid questionnaires, we realize that most young adults at the university actually do not sleep enough or do not sleep well. And that is closely related to mental health problems, such as important signs of depressions or anxiety. Now, what comes first is the chicken or the egg question always, right? But it's well established in older adults that poor sleep leads to depression and vice versa. Depression can impact sleep. The challenge is, how do you change these habits? And we're getting now into modifying lifestyle behaviors. How do you improve sleep? And fortunately, a colleague of ours, Klara Edlund, who's doing his PhD, is very, very interested in this issue, and one of my colleagues at the university as well. And we're now thinking about, talking about what Anne was discussing earlier, developing digital technologies or interventions to help students sleep better. These are in the early stages, But I think it's a promising way to try to change this very important lifestyle, if it can be modified. And I'll defer to my colleague psychologists here to comment on that.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm thinking that sleep is really central, and that all the topics we're kind of putting together here are linked, that with the pandemic, with the solitude, with the lockdown, with the restrictions, that we saw a change, or at least a risk of, well, we did see a dropout from exercise, and exercise will affect appetite, and it will affect sleep, and it will affect mental health. And we're at a risk of a vicious circle here. So I think it's really important to talk about all those lifestyle behaviors as different pieces of the same puzzle. And that is one of our major challenges here. We obviously have a lot of questions to discuss, and we need to learn from all these questions. And one place to go to get a collected result from research is the World Health Organization. And I know both you, Pierre, and Anne have worked with the WHO during the pandemic, and I would, love for you to share your work from there during the pandemic and what you can share with us today. That's a huge question, I know, but what can you bring to the table from the collective research at the WHO? Pierre, do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you, Klara. So my work has basically focused on, in the early stages of the pandemic, in trying to understand what was going on around the world.
Yeah.
So understanding the epidemiology, understanding the behavior of the virus. And it's in the later stages that we have really focused on the impact of the pandemic on mental health. And certainly the emergence and the recognition of the long COVID syndrome or post-COVID syndrome, whatever we call it, is very significant, especially that one of the main symptoms of long COVID is what we call brain fog or cognitive deficit or psychological dysfunction. So a lot of work is being done on this. My work focuses mainly on how we can intervene in terms of rehabilitation strategies to help individuals with the long-term consequences. And the jury is still out. This is a new phenomenon, as we all know. It's extremely complex. It varies between countries based on the healthcare system, the social support systems that we have. And, I'm very hopeful that we will be able to find solutions, but I think we have to be a little bit more patient.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to just also say what I've been working on during the pandemic. It's partly within the WHO project, we've been continuing to collect data on mental health issues among students every term. And we added also questions about COVID-19. We added our own questions. They're not the same questions that have been asked internationally, actually. And what we're looking at now, I won't be able to give you an answer, but we're looking at comparing trajectories during the pandemic. You showed a picture of trajectories also. And we're looking at that for mental health variables and for coping with the pandemic variables through some cognitive coping over time. And actually, we have a collaboration with the Public Health Agency in Sweden to deliver data to them, and they want to put it together and come to a firmer conclusion about what happened. Now that work is just ongoing right now because we're connecting it to the WHO questionnaire that we use. So we're going to see if you had prior mental health issues,
Mhm.
did it become worse during the pandemic, or was the lower stress and the higher flexibility, was that maybe helpful? I'm actually wondering if you think about pain, which I know you work with Pierre and Klara, was the pandemic something that was helpful, or was it harmful in terms of pain, or didn't make a difference? I'm a bit curious about that. Anyway, I don't have any concrete results to report, but we are on our way to looking at it closely and being able to say something more definitive.
Do you want to say something about pain, Pierre?
Well, we're looking at the results on pain. So, and unfortunately, we'll all have to be a little bit more patient with that. And that's a very good question. But just a quick comment about the impact of the pandemic on the mental health of university students. I mean, Klara, you showed a diagram in your introduction slides. And this is the great work, again, of Fredrik Johansson for his PhD thesis at Sophiahemmet University, which showed that basically there was not much of an impact in terms of a deterioration. In fact, it was pretty stable. And that was all a bit of a shock to us. And while we're still trying to understand why that is, I mean, as a public health professor, I think that there's a lot of this is grounded within the society where we live and the structure of the universities and the social structure systems that we have. I'm not sure if the results from the Swedish Stockholm study would be replicable in the USA, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, or in other countries. So I think that it raises a lot of questions to me about how we actually construct our social support system in times of emergencies to alleviate some of these issues. And again, I'm not Scandinavian, so I'll let you reflect on this, but this was a fascinating finding for me. And I know, Anne, that your results present a different picture. And I'm wondering if you looked more at the disabling or the impact of functioning with regards to psychological issues rather than psychological symptoms. But anyway, what I want to say is that I think how we built and structure our universities and our societies likely has a big impact on how individuals respond in terms of crises such as the pandemic.
Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, the difference between our studies is interesting, and the idea that it would be more symptom related in the Sun study and more functional, that could have something to do with it. I think you had also a higher proportion of health profession students in your study than we did. But what I'm thinking about is the questions that we asked about how the students perceived the university's management of the pandemic. And what's interesting there is that from in the survey, we saw that generally a huge proportion of the students were satisfied with the way the university was managing it because they were able to continue their studies. Everything went in Sweden, you know, over one night. All teaching was on Zoom. But at the same time, this thesis that I mentioned with analysis of free text responses to the same survey, there we saw that most of the comments about the university's management of the pandemic were negative. Now, this could be because the people who write the comments have something to say and that they want, you know, the information to get to the universities. But we have to ponder this and see what it means, because on a quantitative level, we had very positive results. But obviously, this has been a huge upheaval. And I wanted to add about what I said about life insecurity. There is a concept that Anthony Giddens wrote a lot about, a sociologist, called ontological insecurity, where we can't really make sense of the circumstances of our lives, and we feel insecure, and that's related to mental health problems. And I've looked at this more in a primary care context, but right now I think that the ontological insecurity, significantly increased during the pandemic and also with the ongoing war in Europe, as Klara mentioned in the beginning. So these global events that impact us all are really requiring us to develop different coping strategies to adapt. We need to be on our toes from a physical activity perspective, but also a mental activity perspective. Okay, big crisis. Okay, last time there was a crisis, it went like this. Things were okay, or maybe not so okay, but I was able to manage. And how do I take those resources and use them and apply them to this new situation that's coming? So I think we need to get into a new mindset.
I totally agree with you, Anna. And my question to the two of you is, have you asked for physical activity in your studies? Because it would be very interesting to compare those who were able to continue being physically active compared to those who were not.
Well,
and you can guess what my hypothesis is.
Yes, I can guess. And I don't think we have a question on how often one exercises. What we do have is a question on rating of one's physical health. That's what we're looking at in relation to what we're preparing for the Public Health Agency, which is something we haven't looked at before. But I think we should add that to our questionnaire. We can add also Swedish questions, so we can add those kinds of questions.
I hope you can do that, and I fully agree that we have to change how we are thinking about, to be prepared for a possible new crisis. And in terms of exercise, the positive findings are that people were quite creative. Those who were used to, go to the training center or train with others, they started using outdoor facilities. So they were like going for walks and jogs by themselves or with 2 or 3 others. So I think that, and also what some of the companies did was, and also the university developed sessions. So they had video sessions, how to do type aerobics or different dancing and things like that. And those were really popular. So I think those things will help us manage a possible new period.
Yeah, and I can actually, at least in a preliminary way, confirm your hypothesis, Jorunn, since in the SUN study, we do measure physical activity, and we have as many as more than 70% that fulfill the requirements for physical activity. So I think, this is a really important topic to address. So speaking on what we're learning from our data, from our research and from clinical experience and research from colleagues over the world, if we together were to try to boil down strategies for the future, we're already starting that conversation. How do we need to use what we've learned so far? We all know that all data from the pandemic it's young. We still have a lot of learn, but how can we prepare for the future? Because I think we all agree on that the risk of having future crisis is real.
Well, I think one really important thing is this issue of social support, because the problem of isolation among university students was maybe the major problem. And the universities or student unions, it doesn't have to be the university management, could, and we researchers could work on creating ways of ensuring that social support was maintained in a similar crisis. It could be, like you said, Jorunn, that physical activity, doing that in small groups of 2 or 3 people, that's one thing, but also maybe sort of a daily check-in with some kind, so people weren't left to their own devices. Because just like Pierre was telling us that when you went to college the first time, you had to buy your own food and you had to cook. And I mean, it's the same thing. The students who were new, who came to university, how were they going to meet any people? They needed help with this. And those are things that I think we weren't prepared for and didn't really have good solutions for. So there's a huge potential.
I'm also thinking, Anne, about all your experience with the digital tools. Do you have any thoughts on how we can maybe upscale it? And maybe, we were talking before about that some people would like to see professional help when they're experiencing problems, while other people might even think it's a better way to use digital tools because you don't have to meet someone face to face. And do you think that we can develop more sophisticated digital tools to be more prepared for the future and to handle health issues in future crises? That's a huge question. I'm sorry.
It's a huge question. Yeah. And I personally haven't studied discussion forums and that sort of thing, but I do have a former PhD student who has an ongoing for many years a discussion forum on alcohol, and it's basically anonymous, and that's a really important issue in terms of stigma and from a public health perspective, because one really clear dividing line between healthcare treatment and public health on the other side. Public health interventions are much more often anonymous, so you can get help, via chat, via discussion forum, via telephone, without identifying yourself. So you don't have to, nobody else knows your secret, so to speak.
Yeah.
But in the healthcare system, you have to tell somebody, you have to meet somebody, the data on you goes into registries. So the stigma is higher there. And in the future, I think we need to upscale the anonymous kinds of treatment programs, because for example, in our ongoing study, we're reaching out to university students first term, and then in second term at the beginning, we offer them a possibility of participating in a treatment study for depression and anxiety. Now, the study, it's not in the healthcare system, but it's on a platform that does require them to share their email address. We need to be in touch with them and their telephone numbers, and they're randomized. Sometimes some of them have a guide and some of them don't, and some of them are on a waiting list. But I'm surprised that so few of them want to join the project, and I'm wondering, I don't know if it might have to do with the complexity of joining the research project. They're getting a treatment, but they have to fill in even more forms, and the threshold, it's relatively low. They can be at home and join, but they have to invest time in order to participate. And so I think upscaling, it's a question, what do you upscale first? I mean, simple monitoring is easiest. And we have, for example, national sites, not for mental health in Sweden anymore. We used to have a national telephone helpline for mental health, but actually that is not funded anymore. It's a bit embarrassing. But we do have a national platform for healthcare that maybe could be used in the future for monitoring oneself in some kind of anonymous way. This is just an idea that's coming up in our conversation. But I have a colleague who talked about, these interventions, they should be like clean water. It's a human right, it's a human need. we should all have access to interventions that can help us in times of crisis without costing anything in terms of stigma or negative consequences of being in touch with the healthcare system and so forth. So I think we need to start simple, and then we can see what more we could do.
It's good. Good, very important. I'm also thinking, I'm looking at you now, Jorunn, thinking about the health effects of exercise and physical activity, but I'm also thinking about body image. Do you think that we could, increase the preparedness to prepare in order to protect students and young from in a future crisis, with both protecting them from body dissatisfaction and also using interventions with physical activity and exercise?
Yeah, I think in terms of increasing their body acceptance, we do have effective programs now that actually works. And they are also based on using digital tools. So I think that area is very promising. I was thinking while Anne was talking that during this period, also a significant number of my age counselors and teachers and so on have been forced to use digital tools. So I think more of us, a higher number of us, will also be able to lead those programs. So that's also very helpful in terms of this crisis that we have been through. But I'm one of those thinking that it's absolutely possible to increase the acceptance of the young students' body and at the same time prevent disordered eating. I think those fits together, and also prevent the development of obesity. Yeah. People tend to say that, oh, you can't talk about those two things together. Yes, it's part of the continuum. So I think those fits together. It's how you present these issues that is important. Mm-hmm. But in these programs, we have to include, learn the young people how to use social media. Yeah. Because that's the huge dilemma in terms of body image and also disordered eating, food insecurity, and all these things. So that's when you talk to the youngsters now, you realize that during this COVID period, too many of them have had even more time on social media. And they have, of course, often those who are at risk, chosen those platforms in which they should never have participated. Yeah.
Yeah, so we have some important things coming together here. And I'm thinking about you, Pierre, having the opportunity to work with research in both Sweden and Canada. Do you think it would be possible for us to pick the pieces with the similarities and the differences and put the best pieces together for an increased preparedness?
I think we have to do this, Klara. I think this is a very good point. And I think we always learn by doing international collaborations. Yeah. But one thing I'd like to emphasize is that the pandemic is also giving us an opportunity to speak about mental health on our campuses and with our university administration. And I think that while the four of us continue doing our research, our students are still in need. And we have the opportunity in our universities to engage with the university administrations into finding practical solutions to assist them. For example, when I was speaking on the issue of sleep and mental health, when I was speaking to my students, they said, why do you give us midnight as a deadline to submit a paper? Of course, I will stay up till midnight. Why don't you give me 5 p.m.? I will submit my paper by 5 p.m. So what I'm trying to say is that by engaging with our students, I think we can find practical solutions that may be beneficial to their mental health. And the pandemic, because of everything we know, is giving us that opportunity. So I would call on all of us to become advocate for good mental health in our universities and go and speak to our deans and our principals and presidents and engage with students in a dialogue that will hopefully be beneficial for the future, because we know that we're all training the next generation of workers. And if you've had an episode of mental health, severe mental health in your young adulthood, you're more likely to commit suicide, you're more likely to go on long-term disability pension and to have decreased productive life. So I think it's our responsibility to do this now.
Mm-hmm. I feel that with this talk and that although we're in the midst of a major world crisis here, I think we still have a message of hope, that we have lessons learned and new knowledge out there, and that we need to keep working on promoting sustainable health about our young. So I could carry out this conversation for all through the night, but unfortunately, I think our digital dinner party has come to an end. But I'm leaving this conversation with a sense of hope, hope for the future and for sustainable health for our young. So our professors, Jorunn, Pierre, along with Sophiahemmet University and myself, we would like to thank you for joining us for this talk. And we hope you enjoy the rest of the World Academic Forum and that you have a good evening. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Klara.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.